quick side note, this book is in fact one of two, as you probably guessed when I said book 1 in the introduction. I don't have it currently, book 2 that is, but you can rest assured that when I do, it'll be on the list for a review. Hello and welcome. I'm Austin Koblarczyk, composer and arranger, and I'm back. This time bringing with me episode 18 of my book review series. And today, as you already know, we'll be discussing book 2 of The Professional Arranger and Composer by Russell Garcia. If you haven't seen my previous video on the topic, I would recommend going and watching that. But, just in case, here's a refresher on who Russell Garcia is. Russell Garcia is an arranger and composer best known for his work from the 1930s through the 1960s. Most of his work was done in Hollywood and along the West Coast. Famous accolades include writing for people such as Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, playing with the Stan Kenton Orchestra, and being one of their in-house arrangers for a while. He's a guy with a lot of ability, confidence, and experience, which is why I found his first book so interesting. My first thoughts, before we go too deep into the discussion, are this book is definitely meant as a supplement to book 1, and I can just tell it's meant to shore up some gaps in the knowledge that wasn't presented in the first book, and is definitely meant for a more experienced composer and arranger, as I'll discuss later. But right now, let's discuss some similarities and differences between the books. Book 2 maintains Garcia's witty writing style. He comes off very funny, personable, tells a lot of personal anecdotes, though less in this book because it's shorter, and has some clear, scathing criticisms of things he doesn't like to see in the musical landscape at the time, which would have been 1950s and 1970s, about when he wrote this book. Though a strange difference I would like to note is chapters in book 1 were called books. Chapters in book 2 are just called chapters. Not an important difference, but I felt it was interesting to point out because I don't know why that would change between the books. So the book itself has around 11 to 12 sections, depending on if you're going to count the very quick list of instruments at the front, or the table of commonly used chords that Garcia provides. There are 9 chapters, and afterwards there is a full score from Garcia where he displays some of the concepts and techniques he talked about in the book. Chapter 1, Rhythm. It talks about rhythm. It's got exercises about rhythm. It's about writing with rhythm. It's a real short chapter. It makes sense. Chapter 2, Melody. So this chapter discusses melodic writing, and it's interesting because it mentions some books I recognized. Ernst Talks, who I believe Garcia actually studied with for a short bit, and Paul Hindemith's. Hindemith being one of the only few books I've ever seen that discuss melodic writing. The whole chapter is just tidbits and statements from Garcia, rather than basically an organized chapter on how to do something, but I still think it's valuable information and was an interesting read. Chapter 3, Harmony. He talks about scales and chords. It's a really simple chapter if you understand how to build a scale, or if you understand some chord progressions. He basically just lists a bunch of chord progressions, so that could be useful if you're looking for chord progressions to experiment over, or if you're looking how to build a new scale. He recommends some techniques in there and some exercises I assume he uses in his own writing, or used in his own writing. Chapter 4, Free Improvisation. So this is where things start to head into that more advanced territory I was talking about earlier. I had to take a break when writing this part of the review because I just wasn't sure of the best way to talk about this. The chapter itself doesn't make a whole lot of... It makes more sense as you read it, but giving a brief overview of it, it's a little hard to do. So for some context, my school recently founded a world music ensemble where they look at and perform some of the music from around the world. We've looked at countries such as Liberia, Turkey, Ghana, Jamaica, South Korea. And the tradition our professor works in that kind of thing is it's kind of a mass improvisation tradition that I believe she said was more native to African regions, because a lot of her teachers in the world music tradition have been African music musicians. And I say that because the first technique that Garcia discusses in this chapter reminds me quite a lot of that, where you'll get someone going on a set part, and they'll just keep going. They just keep going. Then you'll bring in a different part, stop a part, bring in a part. All of you change at once. In this method, it's free, but it's also constructed and organized. I think it's an interesting way of looking at improvisation. And, He then goes over 12 more ideas on how to do this kind of improvisation, though one is just a joke about mind reading, I think. All in all, still a fascinating chapter. Chapter 5 is vocal effects. This chapter, which is basically just 4 pages, I think is just a list of everything Russell Garcia could think of to make noise with your mouth. Starts out pretty normal. Vocal percussion effects. Sprechstimme. Speak singing. Just speaking. And then turns into a list of stuff. Whistling. Humming and whistling, which I didn't know you could do. Whispering. Inhale audibly. Exhale. Shout. Scream. Sigh. Moan. And that is like a fourth of the list. That is just 10 things. And the last page of this chapter is also a small score, page long, describing and showing some of these effects as they're notated. Chapter 6, applying tone rows to practical music. This chapter was a rather interesting one, and especially because I think around the time it was being written, Garcia was probably seeing firsthand exactly how 12-tone serialism was being adapted in modern music writing. He talks, briefly on Schoenberg and his 2 biggest pupils, Webern and Berg, and then describes his own approach to using tone rows in his music. He talks about it a lot in the terms of film writing, but also describes it in some other ways. For example, in the free improvisation last chapter, he listed an example of a improvised solo on a tone row, using that tone row as the basis for an improvised melodic line or background figure. He's also very complimentary of Alban Berg, which I thought was cool because I'm a big fan of Alban Berg's writing, especially his violin concerto, and, just kind of fun. The chapter then ends with a small glossary of serial terminology and concepts. Chapter 7, Art, Music, and Relationships. This chapter is interesting because I think it's kind of Garcia taking a stab at how to write music based on art, or having a relationship between art and music. For Garcia, this means he shows some shapes and kind of lists off the emotions he can equate to them, and then writes out a melodic line based on those concepts, or a harmonic line, or basically just kind of uses that painting as a reference for the line he's about to write. Not always in a direct shape way, but occasionally in an abstract, emotional way. Chapter 8 is Electronic and Recording Techniques. This chapter is a little outdated because this book, as far as I can tell, was published in 1970. Something. Don't know if you know this, recording technology has come a very long way since 1970-something. But there's some solid advice here nonetheless. Again, just kind of shows off this witty style of writing and very humorous interaction you get with Garcia as this goes on. Chapter 9, Comments. Now, the comments section of Book 1 was by and far my favorite part of Book 1. I remember describing it as kind of like having a lesson with Garcia where you don't have a lot of time, and he just sits down and throws out little things at you. Tidbits, statements, help. That really hasn't changed in Book 2. However, it does start out with this very scathing declaration against music that he views as too scientific and technical. Garcia, throughout the book, really argues for this human element in music, and this human element of emotion in music, which is, oddly enough, still relevant today. And as always, right before the end, I like to discuss availability. Now, as I discussed Book 1 last time, I know there were at least 14 printing runs, and it was incredibly easy to find copies for sale, either used or new, through the internet. That is not the case at all for this book. I don't know how I found my copy for $20, because every time I try to look up other copies, it's like, okay, $100, $100, $99, $30, $40. There's this huge price range for these books, which I find interesting, but I'm assuming that means it didn't have as much success on publication as the first book did. Which is fair, it's a book meant for more advanced composers and arrangers, so on and so forth. However, what's even more impossible to find is an intact and affordable version of the recording that's supposed to come with this book. I've seen records, I've seen CDs, they have all been listings that have already sold. So I would say, if you want to find this and read it, good luck. I really wish you the best. But shifting to my opinion, it's worth it. The content in this book is fascinating, and I really enjoy Garcia's style of writing. I think his advice is very valuable, and it obviously comes from someone who has had a lot of practical experience, and has learned these things through the test of time. The book is a short and fascinating take on writing music from someone who is clearly experienced in the industry. And, well, yes, some parts are rather outdated, I still think you can find a lot of valuable advice in those parts that you can still take forward today. So in conclusion, my opinion of this book is incredibly positive, and I would say should you ever get the chance to read it or get a hold of it for a reasonable price, you should take it. However, if you've already read this book, or the first one, or just have something neat to say about Russell Garcia, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you've enjoyed the video, of course, feel free to do those YouTube things, like, comment, and subscribe, all that. If you like the book reviews, there's more of those on the channel, and I'll be releasing new and more interesting content as time goes on this year. I'm really trying to take a stab out and change things up, as it were. And yeah, that's all. So thanks. I'll see you next time.